In the gray morning light before the invasion, the deck of an American landing ship was alive with ordered tension. Tanks stood lashed to the steel surface, their barrels tied down with cables that creaked softly under the salt wind. Crates of ammunition were stacked with mathematical precision, and the smell of diesel hung in the air. Every bolt, every hatch, every piece of machinery had been inspected through the night. Yet before the ship entered the combat zone, the crew turned not to their guns but to the quiet routines of survival. They moved along the deck with hoses and wrenches, checking the pressure in the water lines, testing the nozzles of the foam generators, and opening the steel boxes that held portable extinguishers. It was not heroism but habit, learned from the bitter lessons of earlier battles across the Pacific and the Mediterranean. These men knew that a ship could die without ever being sunk. A single spark, a ruptured fuel drum, or a direct hit on the deck could unleash a fire that no armor could resist. The steel they trusted could become a furnace in minutes, radiating unbearable heat through every bulkhead. Many of them had seen photographs of burnout transports at Tarawa or Sicily, blackened shells resting on calm water, their crews gone. From those losses the Navy had drawn a simple truth: the greatest threat to a landing ship was not water but fire. By 1944, the U.S. Navy had transformed firefighting into a science. Training manuals and drills became as vital as gunnery practice. Damage control teams were organized on every ship, trained to act with mechanical precision. They memorized the locations of pumps, valves, and watertight doors as soldiers memorized the range of their rifles. On the eve of every landing, the crews rehearsed procedures that might save them when explosions turned the deck into chaos, switching pumps to emergency power, sealing compartments, or blanketing a burning truck with foam. The foam itself was a relatively new weapon. Developed from protein-based compounds, it was designed to smother burning fuel by cutting off oxygen and cooling the surface below ignition point. Stored as powder and mixed with seawater through special nozzles, it expanded into a thick white layer that could choke the life out of a spreading blaze. For many sailors, this was as essential as ammunition. Before dawn, they inspected the equipment that produced it, making sure the lines were clear, the valves responsive, and the pumps primed. In battle, a few seconds of delay could mean the difference between a controlled fire and an inferno that consumed the entire vessel. There was a paradox in their preparation. The ship carried the machinery of war, yet its survival depended on the mastery of peacekeeping skills, control, precision, and restraint. As the engines rumbled to life and the coastline of France or the Philippines appeared as a dark line ahead, the men finished their last checks and secured the hoses. They knew that once the bombardment began, chaos would return, and they would be fighting not only the enemy on shore but the fire that could rise from their own decks. It was a quiet form of courage, invisible to headlines or medals. The act of readying the foam lines and water pumps was not glorious, but it was what kept the ship alive long enough to deliver its cargo, its soldiers, and its purpose to the beach. Every ship that sailed into combat carried not just guns and armor, but knowledge distilled from those who had burned before. And so, before the first shot was fired, the sailors of the landing fleet prepared for the oldest battle at sea, the one against fire. The landing ships that carried the American war effort across the world's oceans were built for utility, not protection. The LSTs and LCTs that formed the backbone of amphibious warfare were massive, box-like structures, steel hulls designed to haul tanks, fuel, and ammunition directly onto hostile shores. They were the lifeline of invasion forces, but their design left them perilously exposed. Their broad decks were open platforms without armor, their hulls thin compared to destroyers or cruisers, and their cargoes were a volatile mix of gasoline, diesel, explosives, and machinery coated in grease. Each vessel carried enough combustible material to turn itself into a floating bomb. When enemy fire found its mark, the consequences were immediate and brutal. A single artillery shell or bomb fragment could rupture a fuel drum or ignite a vehicle's tank. Burning gasoline would spill across the metal deck, creating rivers of flame that spread faster than men could escape. Ammunition crates detonated in sympathetic explosions, and the fire leapt from one vehicle to another, feeding on paint, oil, and rubber. Within minutes, temperatures on the deck could reach hundreds of degrees, and the heat radiating through the steel bulkheads made every compartment a trap. The ship itself did not burn, but it conducted the fire's fury like a bell conducts sound. The threat was not abstract. Reports from the Pacific and Mediterranean campaigns described scores of landing ships destroyed not by direct sinking, but by uncontrollable fires. At Tarawa in 1943, entire LVTs, amphibious tractors loaded with gasoline, exploded on the decks of landing ships before reaching shore. In Sicily and Salerno, enemy air raids turned transport convoys into infernos visible for miles. The very equipment meant to deliver victory, the tanks, the trucks, the drums of aviation fuel, became the source of destruction. The U.S. Navy's after-action reports repeatedly emphasized the same truth: fire was the greatest enemy of an amphibious fleet. The nature of naval construction made the problem worse. The open design that allowed tanks to be driven directly onto the beach also allowed flames and smoke to spread without resistance. Ventilation shafts, fuel lines, and ammunition lifts created invisible pathways for fire to travel deep inside the ship. Once the heat reached the magazines or the engine room, there was little hope of saving the vessel. Salt water, the sailor's natural weapon, often failed against burning oil, which floated on the surface and reignited with every wave. The human cost of such fires was staggering. Crews were trained to fight back with pumps and hoses, but many never had the chance. A sudden blast of superheated air could sear lungs before men even reached their stations. Others were trapped below decks by collapsing ladders or clouds of smoke. Survivors of these incidents spoke not of explosions but of silence. The moment when power failed, lights went out, and the heat became unbearable. Those who escaped carried the scars of burns that no metal could honor. By 1944, the Navy had come to understand that preventing fires was not merely a technical issue but a matter of survival. Commanders began insisting on constant cleaning of decks to remove fuel residues, mandatory checks of hoses and pumps, and new drills focused solely on fire control. Yet despite these precautions, the risk never disappeared. Every time a landing ship approached a beach, it entered a zone where artillery and mortars could strike at any moment, and where one hit could turn a mission of delivery into an inferno. The paradox of the landing fleet lay in its purpose. These ships were built to bring destruction ashore, yet they themselves were always one spark away from annihilation. They carried the instruments of war, but their own existence depended on mastery over an element as old as life itself. Fire did not distinguish between friend and foe, and on the crowded decks of the LSTs, it waited only for a chance to reveal how fragile human control could be amid the machinery of total war. The lessons that shaped the U.S. Navy's approach to fire control at sea were written in flame long before the beaches of Normandy or Okinawa. During the early years of World War II, the Navy suffered heavy losses not only from enemy gunfire but from fires that erupted after the first explosions. The Pacific Campaign revealed a brutal truth: modern warships, packed with aviation fuel, ammunition, and machinery, were floating powder magazines. Once ignited, they could burn for days, sometimes long after the battle had moved elsewhere. The sea, which had once seemed a natural defense, became a mirror reflecting walls of fire. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in 1942 and again at Midway a month later, carriers like USS Lexington and USS Yorktown fell victim to internal fires that overwhelmed even heroic crews. Investigations that followed concluded that flame, not penetration, had been the true killer. On the smaller amphibious vessels, the LSTs, LCIs, and LCTs, the danger was multiplied by proximity to fuel and open-air storage of supplies. Every landing operation became a hazardous dance with physics. Fuel spilled from drums during loading, vapors collected in unventilated holds, and one stray spark from a welding torch or shell impact could trigger catastrophe. The Navy's Bureau of Ships and the Naval Research Laboratory began to rethink shipboard safety from the keel up. The result was the formal codification of damage control, a discipline that combined engineering, firefighting, and emergency seamanship. Manuals were rewritten, training schools established, and every vessel was required to designate a damage control officer responsible for the coordination of firefighting and flooding countermeasures. By 1943, damage control was as central to naval doctrine as navigation or gunnery. Parallel to this organizational effort came the technological revolution in extinguishing agents. Early fire suppression relied mainly on seawater and carbon dioxide, both of which had severe limitations. Seawater spread oil fires instead of quenching them, while CO2 systems were effective only in confined spaces such as engine rooms. The search for a substance that could both smother flames and cool burning fuel led to experiments with protein-based foams derived from animal byproducts like blood albumin and casein. These foams, developed in the late 1930s and refined during the war, proved uniquely capable of extinguishing hydrocarbon fires. When mixed with water and air, they expanded into a stable blanket that cut off oxygen and prevented reignition. By 1943, the Navy began equipping larger ships and some amphibious vessels with portable foam generators and handheld applicators. The same principle was applied to airfields and fuel depots, where flammable liquids posed an ever-present risk. The technology was crude compared to later innovations, but it marked the beginning of modern fire protection at sea. Training centers on both coasts, such as the Damage Control School at Norfolk, taught sailors how to use these systems under combat conditions. Crews practiced sealing compartments, rigging hoses, and mixing foam concentrate in steel drums while surrounded by controlled fires. They learned to fight flames as teams, working in suffocating heat and darkness with wet masks and gloves. The exercises were exhausting but essential. Instructors reminded them that on a real ship there would be no fresh air, no time to think, and no second chances. The memory of disasters like the loss of USS Lexington or the burning transports at Tarawa haunted these lessons. The Navy had come to understand that superior armor and firepower meant little without mastery over fire itself. The introduction of water sprinklers in hangars, CO2 flooding systems for machinery spaces, and foam equipment for decks was part of a broader philosophy: survival through preparation. By the end of 1944, fire prevention was no longer a secondary concern but a cornerstone of naval engineering. Every new ship carried detailed plans for fire main systems, foam lines, and emergency valves. Even older vessels were retrofitted wherever possible. What began as a series of desperate improvisations in the Pacific evolved into a doctrine that would shape maritime safety for decades. The war forced the Navy to admit a humbling fact: steel could resist shells, but only knowledge and discipline could resist fire. By the spring of 1944, the U.S. Navy had already absorbed years of hard-earned lessons from the Pacific and Mediterranean campaigns. Every major amphibious assault, from North Africa to Sicily, Salerno, and Tarawa, had demonstrated one unchanging reality: fire was the silent killer of ships. Dozens of landing vessels had been lost not because they sank, but because uncontrolled blazes rendered them useless or forced their abandonment. As the Allies prepared for Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, the Navy resolved not to repeat those mistakes. The preparations for the Normandy landings brought a level of organization and foresight unmatched by any previous operation. Hundreds of ships, LSTs, LCIs, and LCTs, would carry men, tanks, and supplies across the English Channel and unload them directly under fire. The planners at Allied Naval Headquarters knew that many of these vessels would be hit. The challenge was not only to deliver their cargoes to the beaches but also to keep the ships operational long enough to unload and retreat. To accomplish this, the Navy issued detailed pre-invasion directives on shipboard damage control and fire prevention. Circular letters distributed to all amphibious commands in May 1944 specified that every ship must inspect its firefighting systems daily during the final week before departure. The orders covered everything from checking water main pressure to verifying that spare CO2 cylinders were charged and accessible. Foam generating equipment, where installed, had to be tested, and portable extinguishers inventoried. Fuel storage compartments were to be monitored around the clock, with trained watchstanders assigned specifically to detect leaks, fumes, or overheating machinery. Each vessel designated a fire watch detail, responsible for patrolling deck spaces whenever vehicles were loaded or engines were running. The emphasis on discipline and readiness reflected not bureaucracy but survival instinct. Commanders had seen too many fires start from simple neglect: a cigarette butt dropped near an open drum of gasoline, a spark from a welder, or a spilled lubricant catching light from a muzzle flash. Even a brief lapse could trigger a disaster that spread faster than any weapon the enemy possessed. To prevent this, training intensified at embarkation ports along the British coast: Plymouth, Portsmouth, and Falmouth, where crews rehearsed emergency procedures while their ships were still in harbor. Instructors from the U.S. Navy's Damage Control School conducted inspections, demonstrating how to isolate compartments, deploy hoses, and mix foam concentrate under combat conditions. The heightened awareness was also driven by new intelligence from previous amphibious operations. Reports from Enzio earlier that year had described LSTs set ablaze by direct artillery hits and exploding fuel trucks. Those reports circulated through command channels as cautionary tales. They showed that once a ship caught fire in shallow water or near shore batteries, rescue was nearly impossible. The only defense was prevention and speed of response. On the eve of D-Day, this doctrine became tangible. Before dawn on June 5, as convoys assembled along the southern coast of England, crewmen on dozens of LSTs and transports carried out last-minute checks on their firefighting systems. They opened valves, tested pump pressure, and cleared nozzles clogged with salt residue. Deck officers confirmed that fire hoses were secured but immediately reachable, and damage control teams reviewed their stations by flashlight. Some ships even established secondary water lines from ballast pumps as backups in case the main lines were damaged during enemy fire. These routines might have seemed mundane compared to the drama of invasion, but they reflected a shift in naval philosophy. The Navy had come to accept that no amount of armor or firepower could substitute for preparedness. Each ship was a self-contained world that had to defend itself not just from enemy shells but from its own potential to ignite. The meticulous pre-invasion safety measures did not eliminate tragedy, but they reduced it. After the landings, post-operation reports from the LST flotillas noted a decline in catastrophic fires compared to earlier campaigns. Crews responded faster, isolated blazes more effectively, and often saved ships that would once have been written off as losses. The system worked because it was built on fear remembered and discipline learned. Thus, the catalyst for change was not a single event but an accumulation of experience and resolve. By June 1944, the U.S. Navy no longer saw fire as a random hazard but as a predictable threat that demanded constant vigilance. The act of checking valves and pumps before entering battle became more than routine, it became a ritual of survival, forged from the memory of ships that had burned, and from the understanding that a prepared crew could outlast even the fury of war itself. The preparation of an American landing ship before entering a combat zone followed a rhythm born of necessity and precision. Every action had a purpose, and every movement was rehearsed until it became instinct. Long before the first shell was fired, the battle against fire had already begun. Crews started by cleansing the ship of anything that could burn. The open steel decks, often covered in a thin film of oil and soot from vehicles and machinery, were scrubbed with brushes and salt water until they gleamed. Rags, grease cans, and fuel-stained clothing were collected and thrown overboard. The smell of cleaning agents and diesel mixed in the air as men worked through the night, knowing that cleanliness itself was a weapon. Next came the inspection of the ship's arteries, the water lines. Sailors moved from valve to valve, testing pressure, tightening connections, and checking for corrosion. They ensured that every hydrant worked, that no nozzle was blocked, and that the main pumps, those heavy machines deep within the hull, could deliver full power if the deck above them was on fire. Some ships ran quick tests, letting water gush out for a few seconds through each line to confirm steady flow. Others used the quiet hours before departure to run full-scale drills, where teams practiced connecting hoses, aiming nozzles, and communicating between decks through the noise of the pumps. After the water systems came the foam. The Navy's protein-based firefighting foam, stored in drums and powder bags, was treated with the same seriousness as ammunition. Deck crews carried the containers out of storage, inspected the seals, and verified that the foam generators were working. The process of preparation was simple but physical. Men mixed the concentrate with seawater, stirred it with long paddles, and fed the solution into the inductor valves. When activated, the machines would turn that mixture into a thick white foam capable of smothering burning fuel. Even without combat, the tests left the decks slippery and damp. It was a small preview of what real battle conditions might feel like. On the vehicle decks, where tanks, trucks, and jeeps were packed tightly together, fire watches stood ready with portable extinguishers and hand pumps. They checked every engine for leaks and made sure no cigarette or lantern flame came near open drums of gasoline. Each watch knew his section of the ship down to the last bolt and hose clamp. Training had taught them to respond not with panic but with practiced movement. One man shouting, "Fire!" would trigger a sequence, closing ventilation, isolating fuel valves, and attacking the blaze within seconds. Even the air systems were part of this choreography. Ventilation ducts, normally used to cool the lower decks, could also feed a fire with oxygen. Before action, crews rehearsed how to shut them instantly, cutting off airflow to burning compartments. Every ship carried spare hoses, clamps, and canvas covers to seal damaged lines or openings. It was not glamorous work, but it was what stood between survival and disaster. Once all checks were complete, the deck officer made his round with the damage control officer. Together they inspected the readiness report, all pumps operational, hoses flaked out and secured, foam concentrate distributed, CO2 bottles full, and firefighting teams at their assigned stations. The ship was now, in the Navy's terminology, condition affirmative, ready to fight both the enemy and its own potential to burn. When battle finally came, the process paid for itself. In moments of chaos, when a shell exploded among fuel drums or a vehicle burst into flames, the crew's muscle memory took over. Pumps roared, valves opened, and white foam cascaded across the deck like surf breaking over steel. Within minutes, fires that might have destroyed the vessel were reduced to smoking puddles. The preparation, invisible and unheroic, had turned a vulnerable ship into a machine capable of surviving its own destruction. Each drop of sweat spent before battle meant a chance to keep the ship alive when it mattered most. The test of every naval system came not in training but under fire, and the great amphibious operations of 1944 and 1945 provided that test on a scale no one had experienced before. When the convoys of LSTs and LCTs crossed the Channel for Normandy, each ship carried within it a laboratory of applied survival, an experiment in whether discipline and preparation could overcome chaos. The reports that followed the invasion proved that they could. Many of the landing ships that reached Omaha, Utah, and Gold Beaches sustained direct hits from artillery or bombs, yet managed to unload their cargoes and survive. They did so not through luck but through the practiced efficiency of their crews and the reliability of their fire control systems. Eyewitness accounts from the Normandy operation described scenes of simultaneous destruction and order. When shells struck the vehicle decks of LSTs waiting offshore, barrels of gasoline and oil caught fire instantly. Flames surged across the steel plating and smoke towered above the invasion fleet. But before the heat could spread, teams of sailors rushed in with hoses and foam generators. Thick white foam rolled out over the burning fuel, smothering the flames within minutes. In some cases, the fires were contained so quickly that unloading operations resumed the same day. Naval observers recorded that early application of foam prevented the loss of several ships that otherwise might have been written off. The lesson was clear: fire could be fought successfully even in the midst of battle if training and equipment held firm. The same principles were tested again in the Pacific, where conditions were harsher and the dangers multiplied. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in late 1944, landing ships faced not only artillery but air attacks and kamikaze strikes. The impact of a suicide plane or bomb could ignite multiple fires at once, feeding on the drums of aviation fuel and stacks of munitions waiting to go ashore. Yet many of these vessels survived because their crews responded instantly. Reports from LST-884 and LST-687 detailed how damage control parties deployed foam to cover entire sections of the deck, using portable applicators and seawater pumps to build a barrier between the flames and the ship's structure. The foam suffocated the fires that water alone could not reach. In several instances, men fought for hours in choking smoke while waist-deep in suds, emerging exhausted but alive. At Okinawa in 1945, the battle reached its most violent phase. Kamikaze attacks on supply ships became daily events, and every vessel from battleships to tank landing ships was a potential target. Firefighting equipment that had once been seen as auxiliary became central to survival. Damage control manuals were no longer theory, they were gospel. Crews worked in heat so intense that steel decks warped beneath their boots. The combination of water spray and foam transformed the decks into white, steaming fields. Veterans later recalled that the sound of pumps and rushing water never stopped, day or night. Each time a plane struck or a bomb exploded nearby, teams were already in motion, sealing hatches, deploying hoses, and laying down foam blankets before secondary fires could take hold. Navy after-action reports from the Okinawa campaign recorded hundreds of cases where quick firefighting saved ships that had suffered direct hits. Even when explosions gutted the upper decks, the containment of fire prevented catastrophic loss of life and preserved the ship's ability to fight. For the first time, survival rates of damaged amphibious ships exceeded expectations. The data collected by the Bureau of Ships and the Pacific Fleet's Damage Control Branch confirmed what the crews already knew: preparedness, combined with modern fire suppression, could transform the outcome of battle. What emerged from these experiences was more than a set of procedures, it was a new mindset. Fire was no longer regarded as an unpredictable force but as an enemy that could be studied, anticipated, and defeated. The white foam that covered the decks during battle became a symbol of that shift. It represented not panic but control, the visible proof that men had learned to master an element that had destroyed so many ships before them. The practice of immediate foam application, once an innovation, became a standard naval doctrine carried into every subsequent operation. When the war ended, the records from Normandy, Leyte, and Okinawa stood as testimony to the quiet success of those who fought with hoses instead of guns. Their discipline had saved ships, their drills had saved crews, and their understanding of fire had altered the way navies would prepare for war. Among all the weapons used at sea, none proved more vital to the survival of the fleet than the simple, relentless act of being ready to fight fire the moment it was born. The lessons learned from the infernos of World War II did not fade with the armistice. Instead, they became the foundation of a revolution in naval engineering and firefighting science. The U.S. Navy emerged from the war with an entirely new philosophy about ship survivability, one that viewed the control of fire as a matter of design, chemistry, and discipline rather than improvisation. What began as desperate wartime adaptation evolved into an organized system of research, training, and international collaboration that reshaped maritime and aviation safety for decades to come. In the immediate post-war years, the Bureau of Ships and the Naval Research Laboratory, NRL, launched extensive studies of the damage control techniques that had proven most effective during the war. Their findings confirmed that the introduction of protein-based foams had reduced losses dramatically. Yet those same studies also identified the limitations of wartime foam agents. They required mechanical agitation, degraded quickly, and performed poorly against certain types of jet fuel and high-temperature fires. The Navy understood that if the next generation of ships and aircraft was to be safer, it needed a new kind of extinguishing agent, something faster, more stable, and easier to deploy. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, naval scientists and civilian chemists worked together to improve on the formulas tested at Leyte and Okinawa. The focus shifted toward developing a foam that could not only blanket a burning surface but also spread ahead of the flame front, creating a self-sealing barrier between fuel and oxygen. This research culminated in the early 1960s with the invention of aqueous film-forming foam, or AFFF, a breakthrough achieved through joint development between the U.S. Navy and the chemical company 3M. AFFF used fluorochemical surfactants that allowed water to form a thin, heat-resistant film over hydrocarbon fuels. This film prevented vapor release, starved the fire of oxygen, and enabled rapid extinguishment even on massive fuel surfaces. The impact of AFFF was immediate. The Navy adopted it first on aircraft carriers and aviation facilities, where the risk of jet fuel fires was greatest. Tests at the Naval Air Test Center in Patuxent River and the Naval Firefighting Research Laboratory in Maryland demonstrated that AFFF could extinguish a large aviation fuel fire in a fraction of the time required by older foes. By the mid-1960s, it had become standard issue on American carriers, destroyers, and shore installations. Its effectiveness soon drew attention from civilian agencies as well. The Federal Aviation Administration incorporated AFFF into airport fire protection standards, and NATO allies began integrating it into their own naval and air-based systems. Within a decade, what had begun as an American naval innovation had become an international benchmark for firefighting safety. The influence of wartime experience extended beyond chemistry. The U.S. Navy institutionalized the culture of damage control that had emerged under fire. Specialized schools for firefighting and damage control were established at Great Lakes, San Diego, and Norfolk. Every recruit, regardless of rating, received basic fire training before serving aboard ship. Refresher courses and live-burn exercises became routine, reinforcing the wartime principle that every sailor must be a firefighter first and a specialist second. The Navy also invested heavily in design improvements, redundant pumping systems, automatic sprinklers, compartmentalized ventilation, and better materials for fuel storage. These innovations, rooted in the hard lessons of the 1940s, dramatically increased fleet survivability during later conflicts such as Korea and Vietnam. Internationally, Allied navies studied the American model. British, Canadian, and Australian forces incorporated similar training standards and equipment, while shipbuilders adopted U.S. damage control layouts in their new post-war vessels. The introduction of AFFF further unified naval firefighting doctrine, creating a shared global standard for handling fuel and fire. Even merchant fleets benefited, as maritime safety conventions adopted elements of these naval practices for civilian shipping. The chain of influence that began with burning decks at Tarawa and Normandy ultimately transformed safety not just at sea but across industries. The same principles guided the development of firefighting systems in oil refineries, airports, and power plants. What had once been an emergency improvisation became a universal science. From the thick protein foam of World War II to the clear, fast-spreading AFFF of the Cold War, the evolution of fire suppression stood as one of the quiet triumphs of engineering born from war's destruction. It was proof that even in learning how to burn, humanity had learned how to protect. The end of World War II did not close the chapter on the Navy's battle with fire. It transformed that struggle into a permanent philosophy that reshaped the identity of the sailor and the ship alike. In the years that followed, firefighting and damage control ceased to be seen as auxiliary duties. They became integral to naval life, woven into the rhythm of training, maintenance, and command. What had once been learned through disaster became doctrine. Every sailor, from the newest recruit to the most senior officer, was now expected to understand not only how to fight the enemy but how to save the ship itself. Post-war manuals reflected this shift with striking clarity. The Navy's Damage Control Handbook, issued in the late 1940s and revised throughout the 1950s, placed fire prevention and containment on equal footing with navigation, gunnery, and engineering. Diagrams showed not just how to fight flames, but how to think about them, how to anticipate where fire might spread, which compartments could be sacrificed to save others, and how to balance human lives against mechanical systems. For the first time, ship design was approached as an organic network rather than a static structure. The vessel was treated as a living entity with circulatory systems of air, fuel, and water that had to be managed as carefully as any biological organism. This new awareness extended to the design and construction of ships themselves. Wartime experience had shown that survival often depended on redundancy and compartmentalization. As a result, post-war shipyards incorporated improved fire-resistant materials, better insulation, and dedicated spaces for firefighting equipment. The layout of modern naval vessels was influenced by the realization that accessibility mattered as much as armor. Hoses, extinguishers, and emergency controls had to be within reach no matter where the fire began. The ship became, in essence, a machine designed not only for offense but for self-preservation. The cultural impact within the Navy was equally profound. The heroism of those who had fought fires on burning decks was quietly enshrined in training films and textbooks, not as spectacle but as moral example. Young sailors were taught that courage was not only in firing weapons but in standing their ground amid smoke and heat to save others. The image of the firefighter sailor became a symbol of steady discipline, the kind of strength that did not depend on aggression but on endurance and skill. Every damage control drill, every inspection of a valve or nozzle, became part of that legacy. Internationally, this mindset influenced naval traditions across the world. Allied navies adopted similar programs, sending officers to American damage control schools and replicating their curricula at home. Civilian maritime institutions followed suit, turning naval lessons into commercial safety standards that protected merchant crews, oil workers, and airline personnel. The principles forged in war spread far beyond the ocean. They shaped the protocols that governed offshore platforms, chemical plants, and airports, places where the lessons of fire, water, and steel converged in peacetime. The long-term reflection on these developments revealed something deeper than technical advancement. The systems created to fight fire became metaphors for resilience itself. A war that had once seemed defined by destruction gave birth to a discipline dedicated to preservation. The men who had watched ships burn at Midway or Okinawa unknowingly laid the groundwork for an age in which safety, not sacrifice, defined progress. By the end of the 20th century, the Navy's doctrine of damage control had become one of its most enduring legacies. Its principles were no longer confined to manuals. They were embedded in the culture of seamanship. A sailor was now not just a combatant, but a guardian of life and structure, trained to confront the elements that once defeated his predecessors. In every emergency drill, in every quiet moment spent inspecting a pump or securing a fuel line, the echo of those wartime lessons remained. The steel hull, once vulnerable to flame and chaos, had evolved into a living organism, one capable not only of waging war but of enduring it. The story of the Navy's battle against fire was, at its core, a story about the human mind confronting the forces of chaos. War had always been the triumph of destruction, but within that destruction, men found a paradoxical form of creation. Each valve tightened, each hose tested, each fire extinguished was an act of defiance against entropy itself. Where war sought to dissolve order into smoke and ruin, engineering and discipline restored it. The sailors who prepared their ships for battle were not only warriors. They were custodians of balance in a world designed to fall apart. At sea, there was no forgiveness for carelessness. The ocean was an environment that punished weakness, and fire was its most ruthless accomplice. For centuries, sailors had feared it more than the enemy, because it came from within, a betrayal born of the ship's own heart. In the mid-20th century, American sailors turned that fear into knowledge. They learned to see their vessels as living systems that could breathe, bleed, and heal. Pumps became veins, valves became arteries, and foam became a kind of blood that sealed wounds of flame. To master a ship was to master one's own limits, to remain calm when everything around burned, to act when instinct screamed to flee. This transformation represented a shift in the meaning of courage. It was no longer defined by attack, but by endurance. The hero was not only the man who fired the gun, but the one who stayed in the smoke-filled compartment, turning a valve with blistered hands to keep the ship alive. Such courage was quieter, less visible, and rarely celebrated, yet it formed the backbone of survival. These sailors fought not to kill but to preserve, to maintain form amid the formless, to give structure to the storm. Their battle was not for conquest but for continuity, for the simple right of the ship and its crew to exist one moment longer. In a broader sense, their work reflected a truth about civilization itself. Every generation faces its own fires, whether literal or metaphorical, and survival depends on the same virtues: foresight, cooperation, and restraint. The systems created to extinguish flames aboard wartime ships became metaphors for the larger human endeavor to contain destruction. The same logic that guided a sailor at his pump guided engineers rebuilding cities, doctors saving lives, and societies seeking order after war. Each was a battle to impose structure on the uncontrollable. For the men of the Navy, the lessons of fire remained long after the guns fell silent. They carried into peacetime the understanding that mastery over machines was ultimately mastery over fear. The act of maintaining, cleaning, checking, and preparing, those small rituals performed before every voyage, became a philosophy of life. It taught that safety was not a given state but a discipline, earned daily through vigilance and respect for forces greater than oneself. Thus, the story of the American sailors who prepared their ships for fire was not simply a story about technology or war. It was a meditation on responsibility in the face of chaos. They proved that even within destruction, humanity could carve out a space for reason and compassion. Their tools were humble: water, foam, steel, but in their hands, these became instruments of endurance. They stood as proof that courage could be measured not only by aggression but by persistence, and that the highest form of strength was the refusal to surrender to the flames. In the quiet between battles, as the waves struck the hull and the pumps hummed below deck, they embodied the essence of survival: the calm, deliberate will to keep the world from burning.